My first exposure to him was 1974. I was trying to make a decision as to what graduate school I would go to. I was in Montreal at the time. My choices were San Francisco, Boston, and Chicago. So I was going around to schools and checking them out. So I arrived in San Francisco and went to the Art Institute, and amazingly, James was teaching a film history class. I happened to be there at the time. And I sat in on the class, and it was love at first sight, really. I saw this man, I observed his teaching methods, and made the decision then that I had to come to the school to be closer to this person. I didn't know anything about him, but I knew that I had to be there. I was just all a tingle, and I'd never seen anyone like him before. I remember feeling that he was incredibly knowledgeable and had a way of imparting that to students who were just sort of gobbling up every word. The atmosphere was really electric in the class. I'd never experienced anything like it before. And he was gorgeous. And that was that. So I packed up my Volvo and my dogs and moved from Montreal to San Francisco in August of 74. And the term started in September, and James was my advisor. And it was a wonderful semester. I never worked so intensely in my life. I started a very elaborate film called Perisphere that took about 9 months to make. And at Christmas time, after the fall semester, he took off and disappeared and went to Pittsburgh to film Erogyny, which he had a grant, I think, from the Pittsburgh filmmakers, and had a half a year sabbatical from the Art Institute. And I was devastated. I remember crying when he announced to the class at the end of that term that he wasn't going to be there the next term, because he was the reason I was there, because of this man. And I managed to get through the next 3 or 4 months. It was fine. And I finished the film. It must have been the end of March of 75. I was on my way to Berkeley to see a Michael Snow film, who was one of my great heroes, a Canadian-born filmmaker of great importance. And the film was called La Région Centrale. That was a 4.5-hour long film. On the way to Berkeley, I passed James in his BMW. He was driving along all alone. And I put 2 and 2 together and realized he was coming to the Pacific Film Archive, where the film was to be shown. And I got there first. And I went in and I saved a seat for him. And he arrived, and I beckoned him over, and he sat next to me. I had had very long hair up to that point, but I cut it off and had a real haircut shortly before that. And I remember we hadn't seen one another in maybe 4 months or whatever that was that he was away. And I remember him looking at me and saying, "You're beautiful." And then we sat side by side holding hands the whole film. And you really get to know someone's hands after, holding it for 4.5 hours. And then a few days later, I told him the film was finished that I had been working on, and that we made a plan to meet at the Art Institute, because he was still on sabbatical. He wasn't officially back at school. And we met there one evening, early evening, in Studio 8 at the Art Institute, and I showed him the film. And we ended up in a passionate embrace with the deepest kiss of my life that seemed to go on for an eternity. And then suddenly there was a knock on the door, and we were interrupted by Simon, one of the students at the Art Institute. So we broke the embrace, and I then walked him to his car, which was parked nearby. And just as he was ready to drive off, I leaned in and I said, "Do you want to get it on?" And he beamed yes back. And a couple of days later, he came back to town on the excuse that he needed some writing time or something, because he was married and living in San Anselmo with Suzanna. And we went to bed for the first time on a Friday evening, I remember it was, and I got rid of my housemates, and they took the dogs away, and so we had some privacy for most of that evening. And then 2 days later, he came back 2 or 3 days later, he came back to San Francisco for a 3 or 4 day stretch, and we went to Beck's Motel, the infamous Beck's Motel that James wrote so beautifully about in the poem Wondrous the Merge. And that was that. And my life changed, and so did his. What happened at the motel? We essentially went to bed for 3 days. Most of 3 days we didn't leave the room, or we left maybe to get a quick bite and came back to bite some more on one another. It was a magical out-of-time experience. Both of us just soared for, in another world. I had been living with Bob in Montreal for about 3 years before moving to California. And he was doing a PhD in physiological psychology. And so he was stuck in Montreal, and I was going to be going to school in San Francisco. So we had a brief separation with the understanding that we would get back together when he finished his dissertation and blah, 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 and he would come back to the Bay Area, or to the Bay Area, to join me. And it was not a monogamous relationship, but it was, committed long-term relationship. And he was maybe 3 years older than I was. So he didn't qualify as the love of my life, because the love of my life had to be a lot older than me. And I knew that from the time I was quite young. That was likely to happen. But it was we had a good time together. We were good friends. Then coming to San Francisco on my own, free, living in the Castro in 1974 was a very, very, very splendid time to be a gay man. I was 25 at the time, arriving in San Francisco. And it was the only period in my life that I would say I was promiscuous. I mean, there were a number of boyfriends, like maybe a half a dozen, which was a lot for me. And then James came along, and as soon as I fell in love with James, I remember I wrote Bob a letter saying, please don't come back to San Francisco. It just cannot be. It was abrupt and devastating to him, but it was the only thing I knew how to do. I mean, I felt I had to devote all of my life energy to being with James. No question of that. There was never any hesitation, which challenged James enormously, because suddenly I was clearing the decks and making room for him. Immediately, it was no hesitation. Wow. His magical spirit, his dancing eyes, his soul was right out there. There was nothing in the way between you and his soul, is the only way I can describe it. And he insisted on touch. I mean, it was the way he connected with the world was through touch. And the only way he could really relate to someone was holding their hand and engaging you on that level. And I'd never met anyone like him before, and he burst me wide open. Shortly after we had that experience at Beck's Motel, it was, as you can imagine, it was extremely intense for both of us. And he was the beginning of juggling this life, living in the suburbs with family and trying to maintain that scene. And so he sent me away to Tassajara, at the Zen mountain retreat in Carmel, near Carmel, California, or sent me away. He strongly urged me to go there for a week just to give us some space, because we needed it. So there was a lot of that kind of thing happened, where we would come together for a very intense day or two of being in the arms of God. And then he would have these responsibilities of school, and he was teaching at San Francisco State as well. It was amazing how much he was juggling and trying to make peace at home during all this. And his wife was in panic. He told her about us within a month. I mean, he couldn't keep it a secret. It was just too intense. There were periods when I didn't know if this was going to be possible. And there were certainly moments, because I've seen his diaries, when he was seriously questioning the remote longevity of our relationship, because it was so archetypal and so intense that he wanted to keep it in that realm of we would get together occasionally, and we would, go into the realm we went to, but then we'd be able to come back and he'd be able to have his life with his wife and kids in the suburbs. And that quickly unraveled. It took a year for him to disentangle from the family. And then he bought the mobile home in Novato and moved in and gradually made more room in his life for me. I kept a place in San Francisco all this time and would be back and forth between Marin and San Francisco. James was 35 years older than I was when we met. I was 26 and he was 61. And it really was not an issue, or it never even occurred to me that would be a potential problem or issue. What were 35 years? It meant nothing in the realm of the gods. And there was, for the first, until he was about close to 75, the age difference dissolved and really didn't matter or seem to exist. Then what he called creeping decrepitude started creeping in, and he started slowing down. And there was obviously a little slowing down that happened before that, but I guess until the time he had prostate surgery when he was 75. And until then, it was benign. It was just an enlarged prostate, and thank God. But until that time, our sexual life was really intense and remained, certainly for the first 7 or 8 years, it was never just going to bed together. It was an experience was about to happen that would be unforgettable. My goodness, how do you talk about, what's it like making love? It's like we were gods to one another. In fact, he wrote a beautiful poem that starts with those lines that I can read later. Sure. Let's see. Since we are gods to one another, shall we acknowledge our sublimity? We are as holy now as we shall ever be. I am not only consecrated by your caress, I am enshrined in my own amazement. You romp me in meadows of beatitude, you recline me on clouds of devotion. I become an erogenated grail, my chakras whirl like prayer wheels, my kundalini runneth over. This is the hilarity of holy ones, rolling out of bed in Eden and rolling in again. We are rolling over and over in the Isles of Eden. Yeah. Give me a minute, please. Can I go home now? Oh boy. It's like he's still here. He was obviously the love of my life, and I've gone on and I had an amazing 10 years since his death. But he is part of my DNA. He's so here. And to be sitting here, he died right there. Can you ask me easier questions now? It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's fabulous. Every bit of it, all the way through. From the first meeting until the farewell, when he zoomed out of that window. It can't be. I have no interest in forgetting it, and it's wonderful having it brought up again, because I don't. My life isn't day to day remembering James and being reduced to, not reduced, but to experience these emotions. But it's wonderful to re-experience them. There's still moments when I think I'm going to turn a corner and he's going to be there. And that's like, it's 11 years ago that he died. And I kind of hope that never goes away. It's not like I live my life longing for him to come back, or by any means. But it's just a sense that he's still present on some level, as a guiding angel, or he was my guru, and to be able to marry your guru, boy, that don't happen often. Well, it came out of our love. I knew that he had a really major poem in him, particularly around the time of making Song of the God Body. And that was the impetus for shooting the film and to caressing him with the camera, because it's a very close-up experience of his body. And the poem deals with the animating spirit of the body, and I just knew that there was this to be drawn out of him. And so his whole God-body philosophy came out of the deep, loving connection that we had, and brought it out to the world in a much larger way. And it was wonderful to be able to coax it out of him, because that's what was happening. And to see his, he was trying to maintain, a semi-closeted life, and as we talked about earlier, and have both worlds happen. And when that was no longer going to be possible, it was a fascinating experience to watch his unfolding happen, and his coming out, really, which ended up bursting out. But it was a long process. It took the actual reality of his divorce, which I think came through sometime in late 1977. So we were living together for a couple of years before the divorce was finalized, and we'd gotten married before that. So he was a bigamist, and for a while. It was 1976, Christmas Eve. His son Orion was in school in Toronto. At least this is what I'm remembering. And James went there over Christmas holidays to spend some time with him in Toronto. He went there because his favorite teacher from the Waldorf school in Mill Valley had moved there with his family to start a school there. And I was, I had family still in Montreal, so it was an excuse for me to go back to Montreal, and that we would both be so close to one another was, I guess, meant to be. And I remember my sister loaned me her car, and I went to Toronto to meet James, and we came back to Montreal. But I had arranged during that time, I had spoken to a woman friend of mine who had told me that she had heard of a priest who was marrying same-sex couples. I think probably just gay men, actually. And so I followed up on that with James's blessing, and we found Father Reiner, not Rainier, it's Mount Rainier, Father Reiner. And he was a formidable big guy with a sort of a German, Frenchish accent. He had a church near Montreal, and there was a straight congregation, but he also was head of the Montreal Gay Community Church, or something like that. And he had a storefront church on Boulevard Saint-Laurent, which was a famous old street in Montreal. And we had an interview with him one afternoon, and he fell in love with us, and we fell in love with him. It was so clear that we were meant to be married. And we arranged it. It was like a few days later, on Christmas Eve, he told us where to turn up, and we did, and the snow gently falling on a late Christmas Eve afternoon. And we were married in the presence of one acolyte. A witness was there. That evening, we went to a service at Montreal's Notre Dame. That's a replica of the Paris Notre Dame. I think it's a 2/3 scale replica, and we went to midnight mass there. And uh, magical thing to walk out as married men into the streets of Montreal. It was fantastic. Only 3. The next year, James had been invited to a Montreal Film Festival, and it was in the summertime of '77. Yeah. And at that time, the priest who married us had a very close friend who was an Episcopal priest, and he had a country house about 30, 40 miles northeast of Montreal, I think it was, called Dewitville, of all places, spelled DeWitt, but it sounded like Dewitville. And arranged for something like 40 members of the Montreal Gay Community Church to be present. One of my sisters was bridesmaid, and my best friend Robert was the best man. And we had an outdoor wedding. And James was so nervous. It was outrageous. He almost didn't go through with it. He was just trembling with, I don't know, fear and what took hold of him. It was this archetypal thing where, the bride getting nervous before the wedding, or the groom. Then, jump ahead 1 year, we wanted to have a wedding for our friends in the Bay Area. We had a very close friend, Ruth Costello, who was living on the ferry boat on which Alan Watts had lived up to his death, the SS Vallejo. And we had a fantastic ceremony in July of '78, it must have been, with about 30 or 40 or 50 friends present, and everyone was asked to come wearing androgynous clothing, I think was the invitation. So people came all dressed up in costume, and we were married by, what was his name? He was a filmmaker who worked out of the National Sex Forum in San Francisco, and he was a minister as well. His name is escaping me. Anyway, he conducted the service, and so we were married, thricely married, and that was no further need to get married after 3 times. And that's how that came about. Oozed out of every pore. He didn't want to go to bed with everyone. That wasn't the point at all. But he wanted to connect with people, and he, as I said earlier, he connected by touch and seduced people, holding their hand, just seduced them into sort of dropping their guard. And he had a way with straight men like I don't think anyone ever, I don't know who else, maybe Walt Whitman did, but and Ginsberg maybe. I mean, they were all cut from the same cloth, those guys, I think. That's an odd term. No, he was a gay man who got married. I mean, but what does bisexual mean? I mean, I think, he was functionally bisexual. I think the great passions in his life were always directed to men. And his marriage to Suzanna was, as he described it, was filling out his mandala. And there was also a lot of pressure from the Jungian community for that. That's a whole other issue. I don't think we have to necessarily get into that because it's very complicated. But Stan Brakhage, who was one of his closest friends who filmed and participated in his wedding to Suzanna, described the whole thing as a black comedy. I mean, James had been in love with Brakhage before, and after James died, I had a very passionate sexual relationship with a woman for 9 months, and it was never a question of labeling myself as bisexual or whatever. It didn't seem important. It was just a strong sexual connection. As far as I know, after James married Suzanna, he never had sex with any other women. I'm pretty sure that he didn't. A few women I know who fell in love with him, but like Sally Dixon, for one. I think she would be the first to admit that. Oh boy. Well, for the first, until James's son he was hit by a bus in his first or second year of high school. And until that time, which would have been, oh God, I don't know how old would it be? Maybe 1979, 80, somewhere in there. Whenever she'd call the house, and if I'd answer the phone, for example, she would bark at me, "Put James on." There was, for some years, there was a lot of what I call psychic warfare that was going on with us, that kind of diminished, certainly diminished by the time he was divorced. But her anger continued for considerable time after that. And then this very strange, magical thing happened after Orion had his accident. And I was in the hospital frequently, as was James and Suzanna. And one day, Suzanna and I found ourselves in the waiting room at the hospital together. And we had to, I think it was the first time that we ever had to, confront one another directly like that before. We once rode up an elevator together with James in the elevator before she even knew of my existence, which was another story at the museum in San Francisco. But other than that, we had never really been in the same room together. And she realized how important Orion was to me and vice versa. I was with Orion when he regained consciousness after about 10 days of being in a coma. And I think that fact turned everything around. And from that moment on, it was James answering the phone, "Put Joel on." She didn't want to have anything to do with James. They had to have something to do with one another because there was, the equivalent of, child support and other issues around the children. But it was I was the main contact person at that point. And that was very difficult to accept after all these years of her fierce anger and nastiness. This just for your knowledge, I don't even know if you know about this, but when we first got together, she waged a graffiti campaign around the Art Institute and would sneak in there and plaster the walls in the women's restroom especially with all kinds of shit about us. And anonymous letters to James, kind of threatening letters. She was desperate. He was her meal ticket, and she had been married to another gay man before James. I don't know if you knew that either. It was intense with her. But then suddenly we were best of friends. Thank God. I never felt like I was breaking anything up because I wasn't. They were just sort of holding their marriage together by, I don't know, they had very separate lives. He was teaching. They had very little interest in their kids. They both have gone on record to say that they were bad, terrible parents, which they were. I never experienced any guilt around that. At least not consciously. I really don't think that it was ever an issue. Of course, I wanted it to happen, and there must have been, James certainly felt pressure to make a choice. He didn't want to he was a both and kind of guy, he didn't want to make any black and white choices, but it became clear that, the more he allowed himself to fully give himself to love, it was inevitable, and he knew that he had to make the break. Yeah, he always talked about it extending his life in a major way. He felt himself dwindling away in suburbia. His creative juices were sagging. He was getting shots of bull's balls serum or something for impotency. He was seriously not happy, and neither of them were happy in the situation. He was her meal ticket, and they were kind of holding it together there. But no, he was, on some level, dying to break free of it. In fact, when he went to Pittsburgh, before I came along, shortly before that, he had not sexual, but very powerful experiences of male camaraderie in Pittsburgh, where Sally Dixon was, who was a very close friend, and brought him there. He ended up shooting the film Erogyny there, but he had a couple of very, very deep connections that really, I guess, rekindled his gay spirit. And even though these men were straight, it opened him up to the possibility of love for men in his life. And then I came along very shortly after that. And he just finished making Testament, which, you remember the image of the phallic angel in Testament? Many people have asked if I played that role, and I came along just when that film was being finished. But there was something cooking. The gods were arranging things. He was ready. He was being made ready, as was I. And that probably is partly why he wrote Coming Unbuttoned, to set the record straight, or at least his part of the record straight, because there was a lot of dismissal, or a lot of people didn't know about the San Francisco Renaissance, which was right after the Second War, and the burgeoning of the arts. And I think it was kind of the epicenter for the rebirth of experimental cinema in America that James was at the heart of. And then the Beats came along in, is it early 50s? And they got all the attention. Duncan, or most of it, Rexroth and Duncan and Broughton and Madeline Gleason and Helen Adam to a certain extent, and all these people were giving poetry readings before the Beats came, and people have forgotten that. I think there have been attempts to remind people about it, but the Beats got a lot of attention, Ginsberg being at the heart of it. Ginsberg was a great salesman for the Beats, for himself and the Beats sort of along with him. I think he felt that the Beats got maybe a little more attention than they should have, that as a result in literary history that the precursors to the Beats didn't get their fair cut, but he was never bitter about it, I don't think. He didn't hold grudges, that was for sure. Well, Neely Cherkovsky wrote a book called Whitman's Wild Children, which is a great title, and James was included in that. And I think of James and Whitman and Ginsberg as coming from the same source in a sense, and I think that one day many more people will know about James's work and contribution, and that he had a way with words like very few poets have, I think, direct, and he didn't like to obfuscate. He wanted to. Clarity was the word clarity was really important to him. Claracity was a word that he made up, which says a lot, I think. Love one another or die. The dance of life was what he embodied and lived for. But he was certainly the poet of love. And, going way back to the Pleasure Garden, it's all about love and connection. And, he just grew into that more as the decades passed. And I know that our deep love reinforced, the vision that he had from the time he was a little boy, when he first fell in love when he was 15 or 14. It was almost always harmonious. There was some collaborative friction that would happen from time to time. But we usually had a good time. It was usually fun. The filming, the collaborative aspect of making Devotions was particularly wonderful. We spent most of a year traveling from up here, from the Pacific Northwest to San Diego, spending time with friends and dreaming up vignettes with friends, collaborating with people how they'd like to be visualized. There was one incident which stands out as being the only really difficult time. It wasn't all perfect. There was one bump was when we were in Sri Lanka. I made a lot of footage while there, and we brought it back to the States. And I was I don't know what it was. I was restless. I didn't want to stop moving. We had been traveling for a year. We got back to the States, and I took Orion on a cross-country trip that summer. I mean, we were back and maybe 6 weeks later, I went off with Orion for a 9,000 or 10,000 mile trip across country. And while I was away, without my permission, James worked on the footage with our friend editor Leela Smith, and I returned, and the film wasn't finished, but it had a shape, and I love the film now. I think it was a successful collaboration regardless, but I felt betrayed at that point that he had gone in and had the nerve to accost my footage. It was my, there was no plan to do anything with it. It was my work. So that took some time to heal. Not a long time, but because I started getting very involved in the editing process with him, and we pulled together, I think, a memorable film. But that was the only, I think, in all of the collaborations, that was the only really negative aspect of it that stands out. Otherwise, we had a really good time with the filmmaking. The whole process of shooting it, the editing process was always wonderful. We did some of it on our own, but often worked with Leela, who was a professional editor, and we'd go to her Mill Valley magical house in the woods and bring it all together there. Wonderful memories of that time. The films were they considered risqué? Obviously by some. The Museum of Modern Art bought a print of Song of the God Body, and Larry Kardish, one of the curators there, who's a straight man, called it a classic liberation film. And as soon as it was shown there, they bought it for the collection. So among certain circles, people got them. But then there were occasions, for example, James was scheduled to have a film show in St. Louis at the Art Museum there. And I think this was one time when he went alone. He had been invited by, I think, the University of Missouri in Rolla. He had a friend there who brought him there to show films and lecture. And then there was supposed to be a show at the Art Museum in St. Louis. And shortly before the show, it was like a couple of weeks before, the director of the museum came along and canceled it, saying, poetry I can handle, or sex I can't handle, but poetry is one thing. But anyway, he refused to allow the films to be shown there. So, in future advertising or of shows we had, Band in St. Louis was, we got some distance with that one. I don't remember how the critics dealt with them. They weren't widely reviewed, but certainly somewhat. I remember only positive things, like with Hermesburg when it was first shown in public. I remember some people sitting in front of us saying, "Let's go home and fuck." It turned people on, and I think they were very well received for the most part, because they were usually shown to, appreciative audiences, and usually premiered at James's famous birthday party premieres that happened most every year, often at the Art Institute, in very friendly circumstances. Amos Vogel, the critic in New York, wrote "Film as a Subversive Art" back sometime in the 60s, I think. And James was included in that. This was long before I came along. But James was included in that category as a subversive artist for the film. And, his groundbreaking film, The Bad, which was the first film to have full frontal nudity in it, created quite a stir. But also, apparently, I think it was one of the longest running films in San Francisco that the year it was released. So the world was ready, except for St. Louis. We had some of our best audiences in Salt Lake City. We had a fabulous show in Salt Lake City, of all places. We were both really apprehensive, and it turned out to be wonderful. So there was an eager public out there, just waiting to connect. I got a regional NEA grant in 88, I guess it was. And the idea being to make what would be a last film with James. And we shot, probably about half of the film was recycling material from earlier works of mine that were silent films that we appropriate footage for some of the poetry. Actually, I just looked at it a little while ago, and some of it's quite wonderful and works very well, I think. And it was a way to, again, James used film as a way to publish poetry to a larger audience. And our goal in this was very similar, to put out favorite poems of ours and other people's, to visualize them and to get them out to the world in a new way. So we had a good time. I put him through, he did some serious work in that film. I mean, I remember we had to rent a wetsuit for a scene in a swimming pool at night in Stinson Beach, where he was shivering, and there were I made him work, but he liked that, I think, also. In 1980, we had been to Asia for the sabbatical year that James had in 79, 80. And that summer of 1980, there was a gathering of Radical Faeries in the mountains, in the Colorado mountains. The first one had taken place in Arizona, I think, the year before. And Harry Hay and James had been romantically involved. It's an odd way to put it. James was never... It was a brief thing, and Harry was gaga for James, and he ended up seducing James for a brief period. And they had not seen, I don't think they had seen one another in very close to 50 years. It might have been a 50th year anniversary. And Harry had put out the call for people to come to this gathering. And we went, and James and Harry had a fantastic reunion after all those years. I think that was the impetus of behind it, that it was initially for James to meet Harry again after all these years. And James was now ready to bring his message to the fairy world and be supported by it, by the whole community. And we drove to Colorado, and I was fairly fearful of, I had nightmares before about going, I really didn't want to go. It turned out to be wonderful, but there was that initial resistance on my part. I think James was also kind of nervous about it, but all that evaporated very quickly once we arrived. We made a film called Shaman Psal that I can't remember exactly where it was filmed. Maybe it was filmed in Colorado. It might have been filmed Colorado and another gathering a year later. So I sort of was able to hide behind the camera and record things, so it made life easier for me there, and a way of connecting with people ultimately also. James had the best audience of his life. I mean, I think the fairy community ended up being his ideal audience. I remember some of the most wonderful readings I've ever attended were, under the trees in nature, with James reading these beautiful love poems. And extending that to the last reading, I think it was the last reading he ever did anything like that, was at a body electric workshop in Hawaii that we dropped in on. We happened to be there at the same time this workshop was going on at Kalani Hanua. And my memory is James reading to an audience of naked men sprawled all over one another, about 60 people in the audience. But Colin now tells me that everyone was dressed, they got naked afterwards. But in any event, it was one of those magical, that whole period, and all of the readings that came out of that milieu were glorious. And I certainly miss those experiences of the readings. Shaman Psal came about as a result of having just sort of casually shooting documentary footage of the gatherings, or gathering. And again, James, I knew that he had this important statement to make in poetic form, and ultimately the footage was used as a vehicle to express the poem that came out, the Shaman Psal poem that he ended up writing in Oakland. He always did his most serious writing away from the home. And thankfully, we had lots of opportunities. We had wonderful friends around who would loan us places, or we'd rent a motel room and he would go to a motel for 4 or 5 days and do the serious work. And one summer, some friends in Oakland were going away somewhere, and we rented their place, I guess, for a song. And he wrote Shaman Psal then. And then we used it with the images from the film. We were never really thrilled with the film. I'm not a documentary filmmaker, and the footage is, there's some interesting shots in it, but it's kind of pedestrian, and the idea mostly was a way to get the poem out there. And some of the images do support the poem quite well. We had a good time doing it, but it's more like home movies than serious cinema. And it didn't, probably as a result of that, didn't get into the collection, the DVD collection, when it was released. One word comes to mind: always. There was always something cooking. As I said before, he would go off and be totally private and quiet in solitude, to allow the main work to happen. But he wrote a daily journal. It was religiously. I think every day of our lives together, he wrote at least some. And there was always a project cooking. We either were in the process of making a book or a film. He lived his poetry. It was constant. We had sort of worked into our relationship a lot of separate time. Even though our lives were very, very intertwined, there were long periods of some separation. For example, we had a place at Sea Ranch in Northern California in Sonoma County when we were living in the Bay Area, that he would go up there for 3, 4, 5 days, or a few weeks at a time, and I would go back to the city and then come up for a reunion for a few days, and then I would disappear again. We managed to work it out in a way that was really, really fluid and easy for both of us, that supported both of our separate work and mostly his. I was determined to make sure that as much would come out of him as possible, and gave him the space to do it. He was a very gregarious person, as you well know. He loved distraction. He loved being with people. And sometimes it was like forced removal, like, this is getting too crazy with all this entertaining in San Francisco. Let's get a place somewhere so you can get away from it. Because he was easily seduced into being in the public, with the public. We really hardly ever fought or argued. There was a deep harmony in the relationship that carried us for many, many years. I remember there was the only difficult period that I'm able to recall at the moment is in about 1984, so after our first 7 years together. We were living in the mobile home in Marin County. We had that fabulous year in Asia, and we're back into he had, as a result, a condition of having that year off. He had to go teach at the Art Institute for a full year upon returning. So 81 was, I think, his last full teaching year there. And then by 83 or 84, I was feeling really restless. Living in that community, it was great for the first 7 years. Then it started to feel really old, and it was mostly retired people living there. There just wasn't the juice, and I guess our own juices also were in need of renewal. And I think he probably would have, had I been more relaxed about it, and we probably would have stayed there for a long time. But I was feeling really antsy, and I remember at one point he said, "Do you think we should split up?" And boy, that really shook me up, because it like never occurred to me that that was even a remote possibility. And he was getting a little undone by my behavior. I was just like really, nervous and twitchy and wanting to do something else with our lives. And we did. Then we put stuff in storage. We went off to Europe and had a fabulous year away again. So it renewed our relationship. The focus shifted entirely, and but it was a little difficult for a while, and maybe for more than a while. As I'm remembering it, it was brief, but I don't know, if James were here to talk about it, he'd probably tell a different story. Maybe it went on for a year and it wasn't constant, but it was sort of just an antsiness to move on. The cost of living drove us away. We were really going to the poorhouse quickly. We lived in a great place in San Francisco on 21st Street between Church and Sanchez, with a view of the Mission and a 10-minute walk to the Castro. And the rent started off at something like $1,400, I think, when we moved in 84, 85, and went up to close to $2,000 a month by the time we left. And we were really forced out. We couldn't afford to do it anymore. And we looked, for most of a year, within a 200-mile radius of San Francisco, weren't able to find anything we felt comfortable. We probably could have afforded a little cottage somewhere in northern Mendocino County or something, but it would have been too remote. And we ended up coming up to the Northwest. Galen Garwood was a close friend and artist who lived here with his lover Greg. And we had visited here over a few summers prior to that, and finally just seriously did some shopping for a home and found this house that we sit in today. Oh my God. James was a Californian, and Sunny Boy Jim was how he was called that on occasion. And he felt like he was in exile up here. We got here in December or early January of 89, I think it was. Cold and I think we arrived in snow. We actually left California in a terrible snowstorm, and we got stuck in the Sierras for a day. And it was quite an exodus. Both of us felt like we were being exiled in a sense. And we came up here, but I loved it immediately, having our own house. It was the first time that we ever had. He had the mobile home when we first moved in together, but this was like a serious house, and that we can paint on the walls and just sort of claim as our own. That took a while to allow to happen, but fairly soon after we got here, I remember one of the neighbors gave a party welcoming us, and I felt truly welcome immediately. It took James a while, probably about a year. We ran back and forth to the Bay Area for the first year, probably 3 or 4 times, and he gradually learned to love it here. I think he would say that it was the best place to spend the last decade of his life imaginable. It turned out to be perfect. He was really embraced by the community, kind of became the poet laureate of Port Townsend, much to Sam Hamill's dismay. We had wonderful times here. We met wonderful people, entertained here a lot. It was a great place to be. He loved to celebrate, especially birthdays. He loved having birthday parties, his own particularly. We had a wonderful thing, an age thing that happened in our, just quite miraculous, that when we met, I was 26, or when we came together, I was 26 and he was 62. And then we had a 37.73 and a 48.84, and it would have been a 59.95 had he lived that long. And I remember here we had, the only time we ever really, that I'm remembering, overtly celebrated that was for the 48.84. We had a big party up here in Port Townsend. And he loved to celebrate the fact that he was alive and to acknowledge the years passing, and to be the center of attention. He thrived. You turned the camera on him, and he was as happy as a pig in shit. I mean, he really came to life at a party and was the center of it always. Even when he was 84, I remember he was very much still there. Even though he was fading, he was still such a presence. I never liked being the center of attention, so it was fine. I remember I had a little trouble earlier on, very early on in the relationship, when I would see his affection going in the direction of other men, particularly with holding hands or kissing, and that, when you're madly in love with someone, it was a bit of a challenge for a while. But I really I surrendered to that after a while. I mean, I realized I can't go through life resisting this or being upset by it. So I started doing some of the same. I mean, it rubbed off on me to some degree. So any jealousy melted pretty quickly. That was really early on and was gone within a year, I imagine, or less. Big joy came. I think Jonathan Williams was the first person to call him Big Joy, but I'm not sure of that. It might have been someone else. Anyway, I think his sense of the universe and cosmos as a joyous place is where that came from, and that he sort of manifested joy. That was his experience of creation, I think, of the big creation, that the cosmos was created out of joy. And he was a container for it, and he was always joyful from the time I first met him. So he came in smiling, I think is the way he described himself in Coming Unbuttoned. He loved to laugh. He had a great laugh. He was very close friends with Alan Watts, who died in 1973, so I never got to meet him, though we were married on his boat a few years later. And James described them whenever they would meet. It was a meeting they laughed and laughed, and there was some magic. I wish I could have seen the two of them together. It would have been wonderful. He embodied joy and radiated it, and other people responded in kind. Not during the time I knew him, but he went through a lot. He was in depth analysis for a long time. Most of his poetry is not dark, but there are some earlier work from the 40s and 50s that seem pretty uncharacteristic when you look at the whole body of his work. But even in the joy, there was always, he was good with opposites. He juggled the opposites like, he literally should have been able to juggle. He never learned how to juggle, but yes and no singing together were what he was all about, really. Having them so present. I started reading the journals from our first meeting, essentially, all the way up until the very end, when his writing was so small you could hardly read it. Every day of our lives was there for me to experience again. And that was unlike any experience you could ever imagine. I sat there with a raging heart on at times, just in the throes of our ecstasy, to tears of joy, and oh my God, it was astonishing, really astonishing. James was the love of my life. James was magic. James was my hero. James was laughter. James was beautiful. James was God to me. James was my magnificent other. Wondrous the merge. At Beck's Motel on the 7th of April, we went to bed for 3 days. Disheveled the king-sized sheets, never changed the do not disturb, ate only the fruits of discovery, drank semen and laughter and sweat. He seasoned my mouth, sweetened my neck, coddled my nipple, nuzzled my belly, groomed my groin, buffed my buttock, garnished my pubis, renovated my phallus, remodeled my torso until I cried out, I am, yes, I am your, yes, I am your, yes, yes, yes. Let's look at, let's see. Kind of like holding my own soul. I mean, we were so merged that there was always a sense of completing myself when we were in physical contact. Since doubtless I shall have to die before you, my young beloved, promise to construct for me a transilluminated bed like this of alabaster down and marble fleece, in an architectural amusement where I can wait for you to rejoin me while I watch the tourist faces being puzzled by my smile. Being there in India was spectacular, and the one thing that amused me here was this transilluminated bed like this of alabaster down and marble fleece, that we had this wonderful guide. He must have been an 80-year-old man who latched onto us when we arrived at the Taj, and he took us around, and I remember him putting his hands behind some marble, and the light was shining through, and you could see his fingers through the marble, and he said, "Transillumination." It was heaven. I'll never forget it as long as I live. And so that's where that transilluminated, James took it from that marvelous old man. And this would have been written in 1980. We were very aware. I mean, even though it didn't feel like an issue, the age difference for many years, both of us were certainly aware of the fact that it was very likely that he would die long before I would. And I still feel like whatever happens in the rest of my life, that our souls are forever linked, and that there will be some reunion out there in the void. At least our energies will be merged again in some way. Yeah, no question. Yeah. What's happened to me since he died, I mean, it's 11 years tomorrow. It's been a wonderful, strange journey. And it's like icing on the cake or something. It was totally unexpected. I thought my life would be over when James died. I mean, not at the moment of his death, but just in imagining. It was very impossible to imagine life without him. And I grew into life without him and embraced it and went with loving energy wherever it took me. And it's taken me to New York and now to Bali, and who knows where after that. Very interesting thing about coming back to the Northwest, I feel really at home here. I hate the cold. It's not that part doesn't appeal to me at all, but just the sense of community here. I'd forgotten how powerful it is, and how much a part of the community we were when we were here. So you never know where life is going to take you, and I'm open to wonder wherever it happens. And James taught me that long time ago. Adventure, not predicament, has probably guided me, those 3 words, more than anything else in the last 10 or 11 years. Yeah, Tobias Schneebaum, wonderful character. James and I first encountered him having read his book, Keep the River on Your Right, back in the 70s, we had the opportunity to meet him when he was in residence in Bolinas. And we became great friends. And for many years, we would visit Tobias when he was in New York and when we'd find ourselves there. And when he was out west, we hung out together and loved his company. And he and I twinkled at one another. There was a lot of energy there and inappropriate to act on, because James and I were in a very happy monogamous relationship all those years, but very deep friendship with Tobias. And after James died, on a trip to New York about a year after he died, I guess it was, I'd lined up various lunches and dinners with old friends, and one of them was with Toby, and we embraced at one point in the evening, and I thought, this feels good and feels like I could be devoting some of my energy to being in his life and helping him. He had Parkinson's at the time and was really struggling just with day-to-day stuff. And I felt like I loved him. It was, there was also a deep affection and love for him. And it felt appropriate to change my life completely and move from Port Townsend to New York, which was exciting and a great adventure. It was interesting time because a documentary film was being made about his life just when that was happening, when I moved to New York. So I caught up in the whirlwind. We went around with the film as it had its premieres in various places, and I know that I helped him enormously during that period of just keeping the calendar straight, making sure that he wasn't overwhelmed constantly by demands and the like. One of my purposes in life was to help beautiful older men, to bring out heart, I guess. That's certainly true in my current relationship that's getting deeper with Nigrantha, who came into my life because of Tobias, just to have a sense of the heart opening, sometimes in slow motion, sometimes really rapidly. And in the case of my current partner, Nigrantha, it's taken some years, but now there's an amazing sweetness and real deep caring and loving affection. Kermit Sheets was James's collaborator and lover, as you know, back in the 40s and 50s. And when we being Stephen and Malcolm and I went to with James's ashes to Western Spain, to Santiago de Compostela, to leave some of James's ashes there, I felt a really strong connection to Kermit, because he and James had spent very, very meaningful time back there in the early 50s. And I think I sent him a postcard from there, was the first kind of, there had been some contact before, but the first really heart contact that I put out to him. And that led to a very close relationship with him for a couple of years after that. I went to bed with him a couple of times, which I think was the first time that he had gone to bed with a man in many, many years. Although he'd been gay all this time and he'd been married, but he and his wife had never had sex, which is pretty amazing. I think he told me they never had sex. I had deep affection for him. The sexual part of it was kind of, for me, kind of insignificant, but it was really big for him. And it got a little scary because he got very attached to me very quickly. I think he expected that I was going to drop everything I was doing and come take care of him and live with him in Novato, in Northern California, which didn't happen. And that was not ever in the cards for me. So it was a painful thing for Kermit to go through, especially knowing from Kermit's point of view that I was going to New York to be with Tobias was not an easy thing. Certainly in his earlier life, and he dealt with it in some of the earlier poetry, there's some pretty dark stuff in there. and all the years that he worked in depth analysis with Elizabeth Osterman and Joe Henderson, who were his two primary analysts. He dealt with a lot of whatever had to be dealt with, I guess, was dealt with largely before I met him. And he was really, there were times when I would, catch him in a moment of self-absorption, and I wouldn't call it dark exactly, but there were moments when he went into himself in a way that I wasn't allowed in. I could sense that or anyone was allowed in. It's taken me back to the first year of our getting together, and when he was trying to disentangle from the family. But that's not darkness. That was some, dealing with archetypal stuff of the love triangle, and that's not the same thing as I think what we're talking about is something quite different. I really don't think, except maybe when he got into what I remember as his morbid period before he died and before the help of an antidepressant. But all of the years we were together, whatever darkness there was, I think he had dealt with, previous to that. He was a light being, certainly in my experience of him. There was, I think when I think of darkness in people, it's something that I turn away from, or I used to. I think I've learned to allow it in if it needs to be dealt with. But with James, it never felt like it had to be dealt with. With me anyway. Maybe there were other people in his life where this manifested and came out in ways that I wasn't aware of. The words adventure not predicament, that dictum, is something that I've learned from him, and probably comes up for me in my life more than any other three words when things seem off-center or terrifying in some way or another. Like coming back here to the Northwest, it was going to be daunting, and I knew there were going to be scary moments. There was a lot to deal with, but this little voice of adventure, not predicament, really kept coming up regularly, and so that spirit, which really carried him through his life magnificently, certainly is with me regularly. I've always been a positive person. My cup wasn't always running over as much as James's was, but I was very optimistic all my life. I was born that way. And being with James and seeing and experiencing that to the fullest has carried me, way beyond his death, in a sense that, there are times when things aren't always easy, but certainly I think his spirit sort of animates me always on some level. It's, he's here, and if I forget it for, if I get in a bad mood for a couple of days, I hear his voice. He's saying, come on, get with it. You're an artist. Make art of something. Do this. It's my inner voice, but it's, he's collaborating with it on some level. He is here. He's right here. Thank you. I'm looking at this photograph, and it's like going right into my third eye. What else to say but praise and thanks? Wow, what a gift those years were. Every minute together. Was supercharged with love and affection. With a couple of moments that didn't exist, but given how many years we were together, the sense of deep harmony, I don't expect I could ever achieve with anyone else. I don't think that would be. It's not even a goal. It's like the gift is that we shared that for so many years. is pretty remarkable. When I see how difficult some relationships are and can be, and how people struggle in relationships so much. So the gift is the harmony, and to find, soulmate is so overused. It's not. It's part of it, but to find your other half or whatever, it's really hard to put into words. I'm not a poet, and James did it beautifully. I mean, he wrote about us so magnificently. It's wonderful to be able to, and it doesn't happen often, but every so often someone comes into my life, and I have a couple of copies of his book, Ecstasies, and to be able to lay that on someone and say, you want to know something about my life? That's thrilling, because I'm kind of, especially in Bali where I'm living now, anonymous there. No one knows about. I mean, most people don't know what I had done with 25 years of my life. And to be able to share that with someone out of the blue, and it doesn't happen very often, but it's happened in the last year 2 or 3 times with some very special people. And it's been thrilling to be able to share that part of my life with new people. Yeah, it's very exciting. Ludar, a wonderful friend and musician from Chilean born who lived in LA for many years, set many of these poems to music. And his process was amazing. James opened the book randomly to a page, and then he just started playing these songs. And then gradually over a year or 2 or 3, James Herlihy sponsored or paid for the production of Ludar's CD of James's songs. And it was a beautiful collaboration. And so some of these, like The Bliss of With, when I see it now, it's like, I don't hear James's voice, but I hear Ludar's because he sang it so beautifully. The Bliss of With. You have come to me out of the antiquities. We have loved one another for generations. We have loved one another for centuries. You teach me to trust the voice of my voices. You teach me to believe my own believings. You touch the palpability of my possibles. Together we reflect what our mirrors conceal. Together we upgrade the sun in our meridians. We remain open night and day to transcendence. You are incompletely disguised as a mortal. You are the eternal stranger I have always known. I saw your wings this morning. I saw your wings. And you know what? That was my line. I gave him that line. It just came out of, after lovemaking or something. And this was probably a year before the poem was written or whatever. But it's fun to recognize these just little moments that come through. Oh, part 2. When you tickle my cravings and sniff my privacies, when you douse my terror and launch my dismemberment, I salute you in the name of all that intimidates me and pray for a mild winter. But you take me apart and put me back differently. You mend my tatters, you refasten my seams, you patch my pieces and tie my ends up. Then you totally unravel me. You have deranged my accounts, unbalanced my books, crossed my live wires, and torn up my agendas. I salute you in gratitude for this devastation. You are my undoing and my altogether. Yeah, I put him through some stuff, I'm sure. I was really single-minded. I mean, my focus was never wavered at all, and I guess this is expressing some of that, where it must have been a little unbearable sometimes to have that insistent need come at one who wasn't necessarily ready for it. But I persevered, and he responded in kind. Had my soul tottered off to sleep, taking my potency with it? Had they both retired before I could, leaving me a classroom somnambulist? Why else at 61 feel myself shriveling into fade-out? Then on a cold seminar Monday, in walked an unannounced redeemer, disguised as a taciturn student, brisk and resolute in scruffy mufti. He set down his backpack, shook his hair, and offered me unequivocal devotion. He dismissed my rebuffs and ultimatums. He scoffed at suggestions of disaster. He insisted he had been given authority to provide my future happiness. Was it possible he had been sent from some utopian headquarters? I went to his flat to find out. He had 2 red dogs, a yellow cat, a girl roommate, an ex-boyfriend, and a bedroom ceiling covered with blue fluorescent stars. But he was ready to renounce anything that would not accommodate me. He said I held the key to his existence. He said he knew when he first saw me that I was the reason for his birth. He claimed that important deities had opened his head 3 times to place my star in his brow. This is preposterous, I said. I have a wife in the suburbs, I have mortgages, children, in-laws, and a position in the community. I thoroughly sympathize, said he. Why else have I come to your rescue? These exchanges gave me diarrhea. I tried leaving town on business, but I kept remembering the warmth that flowed through his healing fingers. We met for lunch at Hamburger Mary's and borrowed our bedroom for the afternoon. He brought a bouquet of blood roses and a ruby fat jug of red wine. He hung affections around my neck and massaged the soles of my feet. He offered to arrange instant honeymoons and guarantee the connecting flights. Are you mad? I said. You're half my age. Are you frightened of your fate? Said he. It's all true. I mean, so often writers, especially poets, there's poetic license and, distortions and whatnot. But every word of that is, it's condensed, of course, from a long period of time. It's sort of squeezed into a short poem. He claimed that important deities had opened his head 3 times to place my star in his brow. And I used to have a bump here. It's still there a little bit, my third eye. I had a number of falls. Once I remember I was carrying my skis in Quebec over my shoulders like this, and I tripped on ice, and I just went and smashed my forehead. And it opened up my third eye. So there were there were 3 of these events that happened, sort of similar things where I went crashing down. And so that's what that refers to, that, my third eye was kind of split open. And the gods, of course, did it. I had no choice in that. I'm sure that that's what he was referring to. And he said when he first saw me that I was the reason for his birth. And as I mentioned yesterday, that it was love at first sight for me. And as soon as there was a physical connection, all my life energy just went into allowing it to happen, for us to get together. With no choice. I never sat down with myself and said, he's 35 years older than you are. I mean, that was just, forget it. It just wasn't there. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before, certainly. You could say that I was relentless, and there was resistance certainly on his part, but he wanted to try to keep things in an archetypal realm of magic that would include his life as a father in the suburbs, which was clearly not possible to maintain for very long. I guess he didn't know. For one thing, he was fearful that maybe this was just something that would vanish after a month's intensity. I knew from the deepest part of me that James was going to be my life. There was no question. I mean, I made, there were moments, I think I touched on this yesterday, maybe there were moments when he pushed me away during that first very intense 6 months or year together, to give us some space, because it was so intense and there's so much pressures from home and everything else. I remember once he sent me a poem, not his own poem, it was someone else's card. God, for the life of me, I can't remember it clearly right now, but my roommate, Robert, who ended up being the best man at one of our weddings, I remember I came crying to his room and I said, read this and tell me what you think. And it was Shakespeare, I think. And because it was a little bit ambivalent about, or ambiguous, the message in the poem, but it felt like, this can't go on because it's too intense and there's something, whatever. But and Robert also felt that it wasn't like saying goodbye to all that or goodbye to you, but there was caution in it about how that we had to, in order to preserve the magic that we were experiencing, the deep magic that was going on, we had to tread very carefully. And there was certainly some truth to that, but my gut was to clear the decks and make room for him no matter what it took. There was no question. And that was scary for him at times. For good reason. If some young man came along in my life now, I would probably have similar resistances, even though I don't have the encumbrances of wife and kids in the suburbs. There would be other things getting in the way, maybe. Maybe not. Maybe now that I've, having lived through this, maybe I would welcome it with open arms, but who can say? With James, I think the fact of my single-mindedness was what ultimately allowed him to open to the possibility completely. That he saw that I wasn't being frivolous, that this was like really, that he was the reason for my birth. And our coming together to both of us felt like, that's why you've come to me out of the antiquities, that poem, that line in the poem. There was a strong, strong sense that we've been through this before in many lifetimes, waiting for this moment to coalesce and where it could really happen in real time. And there were other things that were, keeping us apart in previous lives, or so it felt, that we'd been through a lot before this was being allowed to happen. James had this line that it came up quite often. People don't change, they just get more so. And that was his experience of human folly or the human condition, that people just sort of become more of who they've always been. I think that's very true of James's life. In the sense, he came in laughing is one of the lines that he was fond of saying, that his mother said that his birth was the most joyous experience of her life. Who knows if that was really her reality or his fantasy of it all, but I think certainly in his life he grew to embrace his calling and become more of an embodiment of the joyful spirit right to the end, or as close to the end of his life as happened. The Art Institute, the reaction of other students and faculty to our relationship was, for the most part, maybe just very kind of laissez-faire. It was not uncommon for faculty and students to have affairs in any university situation, particularly at the Art Institute. It was a very loose place. And in fact, I can think of 2 other relationships with students and faculty that were happening around the same time as mine with James. And it was very interesting that I was his TA in film history class. I was still a student and finishing up my degree. And as a foreign student, there was an issue of what's going to happen if I get my degree now. How do I stay in the country, and how do we continue this relationship? And so I stayed on. There was a system whereby I could pay $200 or something a year to continue before getting my official degree, to be able to use the facilities, or some facilities, editing facilities, and continue film work. I did that for a couple of years. I stretched it out as long as possible. But right from the beginning, there was real support within the film department. There was, it was a pretty tight department, and we would socialize with some faculty, over the first year together. There was a lot of camaraderie, and never for a second felt that anyone was judging the relationship. in any way, except his wife, who was carried on that campaign of graffiti in the bathrooms and stuff. But that was not within the school at all. We didn't go around kissing madly and around the Art Institute. But I was up there in the projection room with him during the film history classes every week, and everyone knew about the relationship. There was no hiding of it, which was wonderful when you think of it. That we didn't have to tiptoe around at all. There would be certainly some affection up in the projection booth. The projectionist was up there. It was all very friendly. Yeah. He was pansexual, I think, is probably a better word. And I'm not sure the origins for the word pansexual, but he was Peter Pan. He was an embodiment of Pan. I think it's a much more appropriate term for him, actually. Playful. He was a big flirt with everyone, and in a wonderful way. It was marvelous to see him. When I got over my initial jealousies, just little ones that happened in maybe the first year or so we were together, it was great to see him connect with people the way he did, and to break people's resistances down in a flash, in a smile. It was brilliant. I don't think he ever went to school to study that. It was, I don't know where it came from. I think that's where he came into the incarnation, with that gift that was developed over time. And certainly as he got older, he had the older man's permission to be a crazy old man. And people loved it, especially because of his brilliance and wit and everything else, and charm that went with it. He wasn't just leering and groping people. It had nothing to do with it. It was a way of, love one another or die, or just a way of connecting through touch that was so important to him to make it real. I mean, he had to be in physical contact. I wish I carried more of that. It's just not my way. With him, we were always holding hands or in physical contact. But I guess partly because of my current relationship, being with someone who is very ill at ease, with physical contact, especially in public. I find that it's a pleasure to be able to meet with God buddies and be able to be held and in that kind of contact. But with James, it was so natural. How I carry big joy into my life? That's an interesting question. There have been periods, especially the last 8 or 9 years living in New York, where I've sometimes looked in the mirror and said, where's the joy here? And, that mostly came out of difficult relationship stuff, that after all those harmonious years with James, suddenly being confronted with a relationship that was not anything but that really required work, was really draining, and I felt a lot of joy draining from my body. And part of that was a function of living in New York, which is not a joyful place. And so the physical place and the person in my life who was most important to me, joy was not a frequent manifestation. So it's been wonderful for me since Stephen started the project, where I feel like I'm connecting through the Big Joy film project, James's legacy, to what's the word? I don't know, to have it reflect back into my life somewhat. And now things have changed significantly since I've moved on to Bali, and my relationship with Nigrantha has gotten much, much, much more relaxed. And I feel that there is joy again in my life, but nothing like it was with James, nor, maybe that could never happen again, or who knows? I don't know what's out there. But it's been somewhat of a struggle to maintain joy through adversity. This is my best photograph I've ever made. whatever that means, best. It's the most meaningful picture that I've ever done in my life. And it was taken on the Mendocino coast back in 76, I think, or very early on in our relationship, taken in front of a cave where James actually sat many years before that, and where he wrote most of the Androgyne Journal was written up there at that exact place. We were down there, and I just asked him to take his clothes off and took a series of pictures of him, and this was one that was used ultimately in a small chapbook that I made with Paul Mariah, who was the founder of Manroot Press in the Bay Area back in the 70s. And we I learned letter setting type in order to make this book happen. And then went into the darkroom and printed, 225 is a number that comes to mind, prints of this photograph that were hand-tipped into the book. So it was a limited special edition, and that's the genesis of this photograph. And then, so it got associated, because of the book, with the poem James wrote. It's called Song of the God Body, which came around the same time as the making of the film, the close-up study of his body, where the camera embraced him. And the poem begins, I breathe you, I contain you, I propel you. I am your opening and closing. I am your rising and falling. I am your thrust and surrender. I stiffen you, I melt you, I energize. I quicken your humor and heartache. I set the spark to your fluid. I stir your mixable blessing. I am your inside operator. I stretch, I sweat, I maneuver. I flex your will and your manpower. I polish your launching pad. I prime your engines of quest. I fan your spontaneous combustion. I drive your vehicle of dreams. I accelerate your valor and risk. I am at the root of your folly. I am at the top of your form. In you I caper and flourish. In you I become what I am. You are my cheerful vicissitude. You are my sturdy weakness. I am your faithful bedfellow. I am your tenacious secret. Oh, it was thrilling. It was wonderful. And most of the film was shot, if not out of doors, most of it was out of doors, but there were a few indoor scenes, but it was all shot late in the afternoon or in early morning light. That magical golden light was in California especially. We shot some of it at Muir Woods in Northern California with no one else around. We were just us in the giant redwoods. It was beautiful. It was like the angels were holding the camera, because I was, shooting with a heavy camera, handheld, and some of the shots just are absolutely still. There was some movement, of course, which was desired, but there were other times with these long shots of his chest sort of gently going up and down, where the camera was held for fairly long periods without a lot of movement, which was amazing, especially shooting with this close-up attachment, which magnifies every little shake of the camera. It was thrilling. It was by far the most excited filmmaking that I've ever shot personally. This is it. This is it, and I am it, and you are it, and so is that. And he is it, and she is it, and it is it, and that is that. Oh, it is this, and it is thus, and it is them, and it is us, and it is now, and here it is, and here we are. So this is it. Wow, that poem was such a big part of our lives. I mean, it was always around in some form or other. Particularly, I was talking about adventure, not predicament, being a dictum and something to live by. And this is it was kind of a mantra in my life with James. And it actually predated James, because Alan Watts wrote a book called This Is It that I had read before meeting James. But so I sort of understood what it was, something of what it was about. But it was Well, a constant in our lives. It was a theme because of the film, because of the poem being omnipresent. It was always on the wall somewhere. It kind of feels like I wrote it, because it was so much. It was so present, always. This is it, number 2. This is it. This is really it. This is all there is, and it's perfect as it is. There is nowhere to go but here. There is nothing here but now. There is nothing now but this. And this is it. This is really it. This is all there is, and it's perfect as it is. No proper gathering would be complete without nipples and cocks, nipples and cocks. Nothing tickles the palate like nipples and cocks. Lose your appetite for clippers and clocks by trying a tipple of nipples and cocks. Up with your t-shirts, down with your jocks. Tempt your taste buds with nipples and cocks. Don't riddle your brow or rot in your box. It's nicer to nibble on nipples and cocks. No need to be fancy or unorthodox. Just try a plain diet of nipples and cocks. Nipples and cocks, nipples and cocks. Nothing tickles the palate like nipples and cocks. Thank you.